Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Wood, or I guess it's mostly afternoon for most of us. My name is David Wood. I'm the Special Projects Manager for Early Music America. I want to thank you for joining us once again for another one of our interest sessions on Zoom and on Facebook Live. If you're joining us via Zoom, we'll ask that you use the chat menu to let us know where you're joining from. You can also submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function. And then if there's time for questions to be taken via audio, then we'll use the raise hand function to be able to request that your mic be opened. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can drop your questions in the comments and we'll be monitoring those as well, and we'll be addressing those as we can throughout the presentation this afternoon. If you have any questions about technical aspects throughout the presentation, you can use the chat in Zoom to send me a message, or you can ask in the comments on Facebook Live. We'd also like to draw your attention to the Early Music America Relief Fund, which to date has raised more than $93,000. And we want to thank everyone who has contributed to the Relief Fund supporting early musicians in need. Over 325 early musicians have received financial support through that Relief Fund. Every single dollar goes toward supporting those early musicians in need right now, and we're shooting for a goal of $100,000, and we're getting very, very close. And we want to thank you once again if you have had the opportunity to contribute. You can find out about Early Music America's activities through social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. You can find us on all of those. This presentation, as well as other webinars and interest sessions that we've had, will be available on our YouTube channel later this evening. We'll also be sending out information about this particular presentation and more news every single Tuesday in the eNotes Weekly newsletter. You can sign up via SMS text. Just text early music to 42828, or you can use the sign up button at the bottom of earlymusicamerica.org to be added to our list. And we also invite you to consider joining Early Music America and supporting early music in North America with your membership. So thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. I'd like to welcome Loren Ludwig, our presenter today, and we'll have a couple of guests that'll be joining us, but I'll let him introduce them at that part of the presentation. But thank you very much, Loren, for being here. An author of an article in our most recent issue of eMag, the magazine of Early Music America, on this topic, Viols to Virginia, and we're really happy to be able to take on this material in a very different way in this live setting with some live audio examples and more. So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Greetings from Virginia. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm so happy y'all are sharing some part of your day, whenever in the day this is for you, with us. Let me get my screen sharing started here. I'm going to be showing some images. And you'll see my talking head in the corner. But this is going to take just a little bit of choreography for me to get organized. Okay. I'm hoping that's working. If everything is working correctly, you're now seeing a manuscript with a title U.S. RIHS MSS5, the James River Music Book. In my recent article in EMA magazine, I discuss archival discoveries that reveal the viola da gamba was played in colonial Virginia and Maryland. The article describes references to instruments and players in 17th and 18th century archival sources, and the discovery that multiple publications for the viol were present in colonial libraries. I also introduce a new source I'm calling the James River Music Book, a manuscript musical commonplace book dated 1738 from Gloucester County, Virginia. The James River Music Book, or JRMB as I'll refer to it, adds significantly to the repertoire of surviving music from 18th century North America. It includes the first works known from these shores for viola da gamba, as well as for keyboard, and the earliest known appearances of music by Handel, Lully, and Purcell. Rather than summarizing or repeating the central findings of that article, I'd like to share some various details and a few ideas that didn't appear in print, as well as some of the backstory of the research. Also, I'm joined by my friends and colleagues David McCormick and Paula Most. Each of us will perform a bit of the wealth of music that appears in the JRMB today. And we'll stop periodically for questions, and hopefully there will be some time for questions at the end as well. In my article, I discussed the supposition that the James River Music Book likely came to Virginia with one Anthony Collins, hired as organist to the Poplar Springs Church in Gloucester, Virginia in the late 1730s. The church vestry committee had decided to commission an organ from a maker in England, and they realized that they'd need somebody to help set it up and play it. The Poplar Springs Vestry Book records half a dozen payments to Collins for his organ-related activities, the last one in 1740. Collins would die young in 1741. His estate inventory lists a violin and a parcel of music books. And I have to say, that's the most creative spelling of violin I think I've seen some weird ones, and that takes the cake. Collins is typically an Irish name, though our Anthony Collins may have come from anywhere in the British Isles. Immigration records from the 1730s are very spotty. I visited archives in New York and Philadelphia and did not find any evidence of immigrants that fit our Anthony Collins, who could only have received his professional musical training in the Kingdom of Great Britain, or less likely elsewhere in Europe. Archival records show that Anthony married in 1732 and that a son was born in 1733, which suggests that Anthony had been in Virginia for about a decade before assuming his post as organist. Without knowing where Collins emigrated from, finding records in Europe associated with him before he left Virginia is something of a needle in a haystack. Also, in this age when I can't travel to Europe to archives in the near future, that also sort of forecloses that avenue. Last fall, I traveled to Gloucester, Virginia to see whether I could find traces of the Poplar Springs Church or any additional information about Collins or the Vestry Committee. All I found was a roadside historical marker and some very overgrown basement holes in the woods nearby. When I knocked on the door of a handsome old house adjacent to the historical marker, the friendly owners told me that it had once been the parson's house, and they showed me a collection of maps and documents related to its history. Of course, the house has been expanded, but we went to the original parlor and I played a suite from the manuscript there. And Kylie and Matthew, if you're here, hi. The earliest layer of music in the James River Music Book, possibly in Collins' hand, is the one that contains the solos for viola da gamba, the fugues for the organ, and the keyboard arrangement of Handel's aria Si t'amo caro. The three miniature fugues for the organ seem like the sort of pieces that might have served as voluntaries in the Poplar Springs Church. They are the earliest keyboard music known from the British colonies in North America, and the earliest music specified for organ by decades. I have searched exhaustively through surviving English keyboard music from 1650 to 1750 and found no concordances, frustratingly. In fact, the surviving English organ music from the period tends to longer and more developed pieces, and to freer fugal writing than appears in the fugues in the JRMB. If these pieces aren't unica, meaning the only example of them that survive, another place to search might be among German keyboard treatises, which proliferated during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Collections like the 1692 Wegweiser die Kunst die Orgel recht zu schlagen, or the Guide to the Art of Playing the Organ Correctly, contain dozens of short pedagogical pieces that are very reminiscent of the short fugues in the James River Music Book. A German origin wouldn't be out of the question, Also, I'll mention that Johann Pachelbel's son, Charles Theodore Pachelbel, immigrated to Boston in the 1730s and subsequently moved to Charleston, South Carolina in the late 1730s. There, Pachelbel played concerts and served as organist at the Anglican St. Philip's Church starting in 1740, so exactly contemporaneously with the manuscript that I'm discussing. Pachelbel would teach Peter Pelham, who would become the organist and jailer in Williamsburg, Virginia in the 1750s. And remember Peter Pelham's name because he's really central to the story of music in 18th century Virginia. Remember, though, that Anthony Collins' connection to the James River Music Book remains speculative. We have no smoking gun confirming that Tarpley, Edward Tarpley, who you will know more about if you've read the article or if you do read the article, who would have been a young teenager when he took possession of and signed the James River Music Book. Here's his signature on the front page of the collection. We don't know whether he studied with Collins or that Collins played or copied this music. That's a kind of best guess based on how few keyboard players and how few capable music scribes there must have been in Virginia in the 1730s. So the fact that right down the street from where the manuscript lived, there was, or right, a short ride from where the manuscript lived, there was an organist arguably from Europe who was clearly musically literate. He was an organist, is very suggestive. The fugues, these fugues to the organ, they're listed as fugues to the organ in the manuscript, but they're also, the range puts them easily playable on a harpsichord or virginals. So it could also be that these are just harpsichord, these are pieces that were sort of intended for harpsichord, but they were originally organ fugues. We're not sure. We'll now hear a couple of these short fugues, and they're very short fugues, played on harpsichord. Paula Most is a harpsichordist and organist based in Baltimore. She is co-director of Burning River Baroque and Musica Spira and a faculty member at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Beautiful, thank you. Okay, back to screen sharing. The other keyboard piece from the James River Music Book we'll hear today is by Handel, who was nearing the peak of his career in England during the 1730s. And remember that Messiah, which would make him a superstar even more than he already was, would premiere in 1741. Handel's music figured prominently in colonial and revolutionary America, as well as thereafter. By the 1760s, Handel's music was regularly heard in concerts in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Annapolis, Williamsburg, and elsewhere. And American publications from the late 18th century frequently feature arrangements of Handel's music. But in England, Publications of arrangements of music from Handel's operas had started appearing as early as the 17 teens and comprise a publication genre in their own right. In fact, nearly half of the music published in England from the 1730s to the 1750s was by Handel. So it's not a surprise that a musical commonplace book started in the 1730s would contain some works by Handel. In the case of the JRMB, there are at least 3 compositions by Handel, entered by different hands over the course of the 18th century. A fragment of a keyboard arrangement of the aria Si t'amo caro from the opera Teseo of 1713, Theseus, in the earliest layer of the JRMB, was finally identified by scholar Sandra Mangsen, to whom I was directed by musicologist Andrew Woolley. But before I tell more of that story, take a look at the fragment in the James River Music Book. There we go. To the right eyes, which were not my eyes, this word symphony, song, and da capo, which you can see kind of scattered about at different places on these ripped pages. And by the way, this is the only torn page in the book, but it has got something interesting on it. These words refer to, symphony refers to the opening instrumental ritornello of an opera, of an aria in an opera, while song signals where the singing is to start. When I learned this, I went to the Handel volumes in the Peabody Library and started looking for incipits of all the known arias by Handel in G minor, like books worth of G minor arias. But I had no luck. Those of you with sharp eyes may have noticed that the first page of the fragment does not start at the beginning of the piece. And I can't believe I didn't notice that at first, but there would be a key signature there, right? There's no key signature. We're picking it up in the middle of the opening ritornello. So of course my hunt through incipits wasn't going to work. Fortunately, music historian Sandra Mangsen had recently published the book on arrangements of Handel's operas. And even more fortunately, she was evidently up to a challenge. I emailed her, and after a day or two got this delightful and information-rich reply. So now Paula will play the keyboard version of Si t'amo caro found in the James River Music Book, the complete version, not the fragmented version. Thank you. Now could be a moment if there are a few questions about the keyboard part of this conversation. We're going to move on to talk about the fiddle tunes and the viola da gamba music subsequently, and then some other stuff. So if there are some questions, we could take a couple now.
I don't see any at the moment, but you can use the Q&A function if you haven't already, or if you haven't had a chance to yet. You can submit those in the Q&A function.
All right.
Well, here's one quick question.
Right.
Are there any connections between this collection and instruments held in the Carolina Music Museum?
Not that I'm aware of, and that's actually not a collection that I know particularly. My suspicion is that that's probably a somewhat later collection, but I'll look into that. That's great.
And one other question, is the handle in the same hand?
Yes, all of the earliest layer, which most of what I'm talking about today is in the earliest layer of the manuscript, and the fugues, the viola da gamba music, and the Handel aria are all very much in the same hand. And it's a good professional early 18th century English music hand. It's clearly a trained musician, as opposed to a lot of the tunes that were entered later, as I'll talk about, are in all different hands, and a lot of them are people that clearly didn't really know how music notation worked. They were kind of doing their best. But this earliest layer, the stuff that you've heard so far, is in a professional music hand and is in the earliest layer of the manuscript.
And one last question. The fugue tunes are very simple. They almost sound like early tunes by people like Byrd, Tallis, etc. Is that possible?
I would be pretty surprised if they were that early. They have some stylistic aspects of them that make them, pretty clearly sort of right around the turn of the 18th century or maybe in the decades afterwards. But that keyboard tradition was so influenced by those earlier composers. So I hear that too. I mean, I hear the Englishness potentially and the connection to that earlier keyboard tradition.
That seems to be all the questions at this point.
Thank you. The latest date that appears in the JRMB is 1821, inscribed next to a tune called New March, which I haven't been able to find elsewhere. Between 1738, when Edward Tarpley signed the title page, and 1821, the JRMB passed through several owners and became the repository of nearly 40 tunes in numerous hands. Dancing was a favorite pastime in 18th century Virginia, and these tunes are nearly all dances for violin, fiddle, and flute. If we include the suites of dances for viola da gamba that are in the earliest layer, the JRMB can be said to hold airs, almains, country dances, courants, gigs, jigs, marches, minuets, reels, rounds, sarabands, songs, and waltzes. The breadth of style and period is hard to summarize, but the majority of these works would serve an 18th century dance accompanist well. Many are well-known tunes, such as Buttered Peas, a Welsh country dance tune anthologized in many volumes of 18th century country dances, Grano's March, and Lully's Minuet, while tunes like The Archer's March, Fig Tree Jig, and the James River Minuet, which lends the manuscripts its name, are not known in other 18th century sources. Now David McCormick will play the James River Minuet and Buttered Peas. David plays Baroque violin in VL and is artistic director of Early Music Access Project and a member of the medieval ensemble Alchemy. Thank you. Beautiful ornaments.
Thanks.
18th century Virginia, with its mix of people of African descent, both enslaved and free, its English, Scots, and Irish settler colonists, and surviving native peoples, became ground zero for the birth of American music. I don't want to romanticize this. Stories of musical syncretism and the cultural melting pot often obscure terrible suffering and injustice and continue to serve some as a mechanism of oppression by papering over structural inequality. But it's worth mentioning how frequently one finds references to black fiddlers in 18th century sources. Dozens of surviving runaway slave notices in colonial newspapers specify that the enslaved person played the fiddle or was known to be in possession of a fiddle. Jefferson's 3 sons by Sally Hemings all played the fiddle, including Eston Hemings, who would move to Ohio and start a dance band that was still being talked about decades after his death. And this is research that David McCormack, who you just heard, is undertaking at the moment. And among many compelling stories is that of one Simeon Gilead, a virtuoso violinist and fiddle player in Williamsburg and Richmond, Virginia, in the second half of the 18th century, whose obituary of 1820 reads, a man of color, very celebrated as a fiddler and much caressed by polished society, who will long deplore the loss of one so ingeniously skilled in his profession. And now's another moment for a few questions, if they're out there. The next section will be about the viola da gamba layer of the manuscript.
Here's a question. Are any ornaments indicated or written out in the manuscript?
Yes. Not so on the repeats that David was doing, he was gracing, more than what was in the manuscript. He was adding sort of little division style licks and stuff. The pieces in the earliest layer of the manuscript, and in fact, a lot of the later layers too, because I think musicians who had the manuscript later were looking back at the earlier layers and being influenced by the notation and the tunes and stuff like that. But there's the full range of early 18th century English ornaments. You've got, the sort of equal sign on its side, signaling trill, signs for mordants, and various other sort of graces that are familiar from repertory of that period.
Another question, what else is known about Simeon Gilead? Is there documentation beyond this obituary?
That's a great question, and actually this is a research that I'm working on now, and working with David McCormack. We've been fellows at the Jefferson Foundation Library in Charlottesville, and we're hoping to go back this next year once such things are possible and continue that research. But yes, there is a bit more archival material related to Gilead that's known, and I'm actually convinced that there's more information that can be found on him in some other sources that I'd like to consult. But he's a very compelling and fascinating character, and there are some wonderful, colorful descriptions of him from some 19th century publications, sort of remembering these sort of famous characters in Virginia of the 18th century.
Do we know where the manuscript originated? Was it begun here or in Europe somewhere?
That's a great question. The paper is almost certainly European, and the earliest layer of music was written by a European hand. So some aspect of it began in Europe. Whether that manuscript came with a musician to Virginia with music already in it, or whether it was penned once it was in Virginia, I haven't been able to figure out. But the manuscript and the earliest layer of music are all from Europe, and we can trace them to Virginia starting at At the latest, they started being in Virginia, the music and the book, in 1738.
That seems to be all the questions for now.
Right. Dance tunes from the 18th century Virginia, as you just heard, always raise questions about race. Where did some of these tunes originate? Who composed them? Who played them? Who wrote them down? Who danced to them? As I'll explain later in today's presentation, the viola da gamba is actually subject to similar questions, both in its various European contexts and especially in the colonial Black Atlantic world of the 18th century British tobacco colonies of North America. But before we get there, I'd like to discuss a more familiar and perhaps more comfortable instance of intercultural exchange that shapes the story of the viola da gamba in this colonial context. Those familiar with the history of 18th century European music will know of the contemporaneous tendency to characterize music as either Italian or French in style. I once heard a prominent musicologist joke that the first question to ask of any piece of 18th century German music is whether it's Italian or French. The same could be said of English music of the period, and the received musical history of colonial America leans heavily on a narrative that Italian music dominated 18th century tastes on these shores. The two most complete inventories of musical libraries from 18th century Virginia, those of Cuthbert Ogle from Williamsburg, Virginia in the 1750s, and Thomas Jefferson from Monticello later in the century, reveal a marked preference for Italian music. Cuthbert Ogle was an English violinist and music teacher who appeared in Williamsburg, Virginia, then the colonial capital in the 1750s. He brought with him a library of dozens of musical titles, including works by Alberti, Avicen, Corelli, Gimignani, Giardini, Handel, lots and lots of Handel, Pasquale, Purcell, and many others. Nearly all are Italian composers or English composers like Avicen and Handel, working in an explicitly Italian style. And we can quibble about whether Handel was an English composer or a German composer. He was certainly composing Italianate music. Cuthbert would die less than a month after his arrival in Williamsburg, and none other than Peter Pelham, the town organist and jailer whom we met earlier, would take possession of Cuthbert's music library. But another item in Cuthbert Ogle's library has escaped identification with the viola da gamba until now. Among the publications in the inventory is one listed as Concertos by Ramsay. These turn out to be Jean-Philippe Rameau's Pièces de clavecin en concert, a wonderful collection of up-to-the-minute French chamber music for harpsichord, violin or flute, and viola da gamba. Rameau's Pièces de clavecin en concert is considered one of the touchstones of 18th century chamber music featuring the viola da gamba, and its presence in colonial Virginia largely obliterates Jefferson's later claims that Virginia lacked any sophisticated European music. If Paula, David, and myself could be together in the same room, these elegant, stylish, virtuoso trios by Rameau are what we'd be playing for you. So how did they go unnoticed by generations of music historians? Rameau had published his collection in Paris in 1741, but the print listed in Cuthbert's library was the 1750 print by John Walsh II, who largely controlled English music publishing from the 1730s to the 1760s. And what a lot of these 18th century English publishers did was just literally, there was no copyright. They would just get these European prints and re-engrave them or reprint them and put their own title page on them. Walsh evidently thought that the viola da gamba was out of fashion, for he changed Rameau's title to 5 Concertos for the Harpsichord, composed by Mr. Rameau, accompanied with a violin or German flute or 2 violins and a viola. Accompanied with a violin or German flute or 2 violins and a viola. And now that I read that, or viola, that's the problem. I copied it wrong. Unless you happen to be a viol-playing Rameau fanboy, you might not recognize these contents for what they are. Based on Walsh's title page, he suppressed the viola da gamba in the title. But open the collection and it becomes immediately evident that Walsh's description is a lie. He in fact reprinted exactly the viola da gamba part that appears in Rameau's original. And here's a comparison of Rameau's, the opening of Rameau's and the opening of Walsh's publications. The second line down is the viola da gamba part, and you can see in both versions it's in bass clef, and it shows the 7-string viol with those low A's. So clearly Walsh's claim that you could play this on 2 violins or on a violin and a flute doesn't make a lot of sense, doesn't reflect the contents. Now I'm lost. This means that at least 3 rich sources of music for viola da gamba were circulating in mid-century Virginia. John Playford's A Brief Introduction to the Skill of Music, which I discuss in the printed article, Rameau's virtuosic and groundbreaking Pièce de clavecin en concert, and the James River Music Book with its suites and pieces for solo viol. The dances and airs for viol in the manuscript are very similar to the dozens of such pieces that appeared in England and France in the decades on either side of the turn of the 18th century. They are petite, elegant, technically accessible works that reveal a complete synthesis of French and English writing for the instrument. Though circumstances and some details of notation make an English origin most likely, the fact is that one finds dances just like these in late 17th century collections by Saint-Colombe, Ottmann, Dubuisson, and others. I have searched exhaustively for concordances, but have found only hints, which has led me to assert that these pieces are unica. They are definitely firmly on the French side of the Italian-French divide, though, and alongside the Rameau, suggest that there may have been more French music happening in the 18th century colonies than has been previously recognized. I had planned to play a few of these pieces for you. I have a bit of an injury, so I've been resting my hand, so we're going to switch to some live takes that I made when I was recording these pieces last summer with the help of the Viola da Gamba Society of America, which generously supported the recording with a grant. So first you're going to hear an Almain, and then you'll hear an untitled piece that is a bit of a generic mystery to me. I can't quite figure out what it is, but here they are. I disappeared. Let me see if I can come back. All right. Finally, I want to turn to a character who embodies some of the complexities of viol playing in the 18th century colonies. Thomas Bacon, 1711 to 1768, was an Episcopal clergyman, musician, publisher, and author. Born on the Isle of Man, Bacon was educated in Ireland and emigrated to Maryland in the 1740s. Once in Maryland, Bacon became a member of the Tuesday Club, a group of mid-century colonial music enthusiasts who performed chamber music, accompanied ballad operas and dances, and composed music for club ceremonies. And here's the records of the Tuesday Club at Archives in Baltimore are amazing and filled with all these handwritten drawings and poems and sheet music, all kinds of interesting things. The extensive records of the Tuesday Club mention that on May 26, 1747, Bacon performed on a Viola gamba, or six-stringed bass. The thousands of pages of surviving Tuesday Club records reveal all kinds of kooky ceremonies presided over by club members, and featuring an abundance of song, instrumental music, and doggerel verse. All members were officially known by their pseudonyms, such as Electrico Vertrifico for Ben Franklin, who had supposedly demonstrated an electronic musical instrument in the Tuesday Club in the 1750s, and Signor Lardini for Thomas Bacon. Bacon was fascinated by musical instruments. Among the Tuesday Club records are numerous long poems describing the club's musical and theatrical activities. An excerpt of one such poem, dated 1754, reads, "Sackbuts, cymbals, timbrels, lutes, banjos, dulcimers, and flutes, bagpipe drones with snuffling bellows, viols, violins, violoncellos, pipes and tabors, kettle drums, trumpets shrill and deep hum strums, harpsichord and hautboy sharp, Irish, Welsh, and Jewish harp, grave Hibernian clairchaux, cor de chasse, guitar also." This passage is notable for the interest and knowledge of musical instruments it reveals, but also for the appearance of the word banjo, which was known to be an African instrument in such close proximity to viol. In 1755, in a letter to another musical Tuesday Club member, Bacon writes, quote, "Your strum must wait till the garden will permit me a day or two's leisure to tinkle it at Oxford." Bacon's writing from Oxford, Maryland at this point, by the way. I had despaired of ever knowing what Bacon meant by strum until I accidentally happened on Dr. Hans Sloane's 1707 publication, A Voyage to the Islands Madeira, Barbados, Nevis, St. Christopher's, and Jamaica. Sloane was an Irish physician, naturalist, and collector who had traveled to the West Indies in the 1680s and made extensive notes and drawings that were eventually published a couple decades later. Sloane would be elected to the Royal Society at age 24, and would later donate more than 70,000 items that would become the foundation of the British Museum and the British Library. Among music historians, Sloane is famous for several illustrations of African instruments that he observed in use among enslaved people in the West Indies, including the first known European representation of a banjo. Take a look at the caption for this famous illustration. I've circled it in green. The name that, I don't know the story here, I don't know whether the West Indian banjo player told Sloane that he was playing a strum, or somebody inferred that was, I don't know where that comes from, but my suspicion is that Thomas Bacon, when he's writing to his friend Callister about his strum and wanting to play it in the garden, is probably referring to this other Irish treatise, right? Bacon was Irish. Here's another Irishman who, write exactly in the same period. Bacon was the sort of erudite individual who would have Sloane's book. One might be tempted here to construct a hopeful narrative about Bacon's evident interest in African music alongside his enthusiasm for the viola da gamba, itself something of a musical curiosity in 1750s Maryland. Yet Bacon, an Episcopal clergyman, became most well known for his publication, Two Sermons Preached to a Congregation of Black Slaves, The first of which, both of which are essentially arguing in a very patronizing way that slaves should accept their place because God has ordained that the way that slaves behave towards their masters and mistresses is actually the way they're behaving towards God. So if they offend their masters and mistresses, that's an offense against God. It's right up the center of the sort of most horrifying justifications, Christian justifications for slavery that were being circulated in the 18th century, sort of as the abolition movement was beginning. One of the responses to it was this one. My research on the James River Music Book and the Viola da Gamba in colonial Virginia and Maryland brings with it a proximity to the history of slavery and the complex diasporic culture and economy of what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. Quote, a cultural political space that is not specifically African, American, Caribbean, or British, but is rather a hybrid mix of all these at once. Writing about early modern musical culture in Europe, which is what I often do, it remains possible to strategically ignore the presence of Black participants in European courtly culture, as well as a European economy fueled by the slave trade. But in American archives, the Black Atlantic is everywhere, and writing about Baroque music in a colonial context serves as a useful corrective to the habit of ignoring race as a salient feature of European culture. The archives in Virginia and Maryland are rich with references to Black Atlantic culture, even if a researcher must read across or against records left by white colonial planters and aristocrats. Writing about this material is challenging. It doesn't prostrate itself neatly to the conventions of authorship and evidence most familiar to historians of early music. These scholarly conventions have political consequences. Meaningful racial and gender inclusivity require a rethinking of the research practices and habits of argument that have served to keep early music so white. One key intervention was Christopher Small's coinage of the word musicking, a verb as opposed to a noun, that encourages scholars and performers to think about the rich complexity of music as a culturally embedded action. Quote, the fundamental nature and meaning of music, Small writes, lie not in objects, not in musical works at all, but in action, in what people do. It is only by understanding what people do as they take part in a musical act that we can hope to understand its nature and the function it fulfills in human life. One corollary to this formulation is to make visible the people that support any musical act, including, as Small writes, the person who takes the tickets at the door, to the hefty men who shift the piano and the drums, to the roadies who set up the instruments, to the cleaners who clean up after everyone else is gone. In other words, everybody that's involved in supporting a musical act is part of the meaning that happens as a result of that act. Manuscripts like the James River Music Book are a material residue of musical action and of a colonial culture with slavery and the contested presence of Black bodies at its center. Edward Tarpley's will, the guy who owned the manuscript, who signed it, doesn't mention a viola da gamba, but it does begin with his bequeathing his loving and affectionate mother his Negro girl Sal during her natural life. The first item in his will was his slave. Just a couple years after Tarpley's premature death in 1763, another musical planter in Williamsburg, Robert Carter of Nominee Hall, ordered an organ from England, likely one that very closely resembled the organ Anthony Collins set up and played in the Poplar Springs Church. Small English organs of the period were typically built with a foot pedal so that the player could operate the bellows. However, Carter's agent specifies a modification in one of his letters to the instrument builders in England. Quote, 2 bellows must be made for this gentleman's organ, and each of them, the bellows, must be finished with a handle, as he purposes to employ a servant to blow whenever he uses the organ, and therefore desires there be no contrivance to blow with the foot. Servant, of course, is the classic euphemism in the 18th century for enslaved person. Carter wanted his organ built so that one of his enslaved people could operate it. Here we see the material effects of the slave economy on the actual design of keyboard instruments. In Annapolis, Maryland, another passage of a Tuesday Club meeting from the 1750s reads, quote, "A certain tall, gigantic Negro fellow, bringing into the club room the bass viol on which the secretary that night performed solo, elevated on his head in a great wooden case, much in the shape of a coffin, encountered his lordship at the door, and not stepping back with that respect and deference which he ought to have showed to so illustrious a personage, hit his lordship a terrible thump with the case on his forehead, just over one of his eyebrows, which made his lordship stagger back and rub his face with his hands. But the blow was so violent that it soon raised a frightful bump upon the place." Then, of course, there are the scattered accounts of Simeon Gilead, the black fiddler, quote, "much caressed by polished society." There are many more such encounters in the archive. These individuals participated in colonial musicking in important ways, and I'm struggling to figure out how to tell the story of European music in the colonies that renders them visible. Pumping an organ, for example, is not unskilled labor and requires an attention and engagement with what's happening at the keyboard, a musical engagement. The fact that organ builders back in England had to modify long-cherished designs to allow for the participation, however unwilling and unacknowledged, by enslaved people requires a different kind of attention to race in our historiography. Descriptions of Gilead strongly suggest that he was a literate musician who participated broadly in colonial musicking. The absence from the historical record of works or writings by these individuals should not erase their presence and participation in colonial musical culture. And finding ways to make these stories visible in our historiography can result, I think, in ways of thinking about performance and scholarship that help foster racial inclusivity. Allowing the Black Atlantic to speak in scholarship on colonial American music encourages both a recognition of the always already presence of African people in Europe in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, and offers a corrective to a contemporary early music performance culture that still largely imagines itself as white. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loren. And we do have some time to take questions. There are a couple here, and let me see if I can. Okay, you mentioned the inclusion of pieces by Handel. Is there also any inclusion of theater music from Maine and after pieces, mainly those used in Charleston and Williamsburg theaters in the mid-late 18th century? That's the beginning of a question, and we'll pick up a little bit more after.
There are in the later layers of, there are three pieces by Handel that I've identified so far in the James River Music Book. One of them you heard already, that one from Teseo, that adaptation. But then there are some dance pieces. And as you say, the theater and dance music of Handel circulated very widely later in the 18th century in Virginia. And so the later pieces in the James River Music Book by Handel are in that style, you know, Minuet from Saul, and, you know, various dances and excerpts from theatrical works that were circulating.
And then continuing, do any of these or other pieces in the collection involve voice with or without text, and or winds, especially flute, as does much of the music that survives from Williamsburg, like Arne, Smith, Gay, and Lindley?
There are several sets of dances specified for flute in the James River Music Book. And typically that's, you know, dances for flute followed by 12 pieces. And I'm struggling to identify those still. There was another component of that question that
voice.
Right, voice. There is a Handel aria, Kyo. I'm on the spot here and I'm forgetting the Italian name for it. But it's for the first. There's only one page of it copied out, but it's for violin, viola, continuo, and voice. And again, it's only one page, but that's enough to suggest that somebody in Virginia knew and performed that piece.
And you've mentioned a little bit here, but are there other indications in the manuscript or any of the concordances for other instruments beyond what you've already mentioned?
Flute, violin, fiddle, viola da gamba, organ, harpsichord, voice. I believe those are it.
Will there be any upcoming performing editions of the viol music?
Yes, I have an article, a sort of scholarly article on the source under review, and I'm working on a scholarly edition. Very soon I'm just going to upload also the manuscript scans to the internet. But yeah, all those things are underway.
A question about Simeon Gilead. Was he a free man?
He was eventually. The records suggest that he purchased his. I think he purchased his freedom at a certain point. That's one of the things I'm trying to track is how that worked.
Mm-hmm. There is a question, and I'm not sure, this may be from other research you've done. Is there any info on slaves participating in Jefferson's soirees?
I'm not, I must admit that my research has been a bit earlier than the sort of straight ahead Jefferson stuff, which is about 50 years later than this source. But David McCormick may be able to chime in with an answer to that.
Hello.
There he is.
Yes and no. I think there's one of the Hemmings brothers definitely played. It was either for the daughters or the granddaughters when they would dance. And so this wouldn't have been for Jefferson's like big soirees, but when the kids or grandkids were getting together with their friends, one of the Hemmings brothers would play. When Lafayette came to visit Jefferson, a free black man on Main Street in Charlottesville, Jesse Scott, actually played for that, along with, I think, two of his children. And Jefferson was very fond of Jesse Scott and would come down into Main Street, Charlottesville, and listen to the Scott family play on occasion.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that Simeon Gilead was famous when Governor Fakir was governor of colonial Virginia in the 1760s and 70s. His favorite fiddler was Simeon Gilead, who would play at the big balls.
What do you know of the tuning that the viol music would have used?
Great question. Those with sharp eyes may have noticed that the first Almain that I played had an instruction in the corner that said, let down the sixth string one note lower. So an English dropped C tuning, as we see in Abel and Simpson, and Mace describes that. There's lots of discussion of that tuning. And that's in fact how I know that this music is for viola da gamba, because it says, let down the sixth string one note lower. What a gift that we don't have to have arguments about what instrument that music was for. So I have played all of it in a drop C tuning. The second suite that you didn't hear, you heard a bits of the C major suite. There are about 4 or 5 other movements of that. There's also a D minor suite, and you can play it with a drop C tuning, but it's better with a D, with a low D string on the bottom.
You mentioned that there's music by Lully in the manuscript. Do you know, or can you tell us what those are, or some of them?
Yeah, in the earliest layer, there's an arrangement for solo viola da gamba of a piece from one of Lully's operas, Ati, and there's also next to it a companion piece. Purcell also wrote a version of that melody from Lully's opera, and those two pieces sit side by side. These peculiar solo viola da gamba versions of Lully's dance music, one by Lully and one by Purcell. And then in subsequent layers, there are a couple of dances, Minuet by Lully, that you see circulating all over the place in the late 18th century, and you can sort of trace back through the late 17th century.
I think we have one last question, and some people might know the answer, but not everyone knows. What what defines the difference between a fiddle and a violin? Because we've talked about for fiddle or for violin. So can you explain the difference?
David, I'm going to call in my lifeline on that.
I'm here to help you. It is only the style of playing. There are some fiddlers that set up their violins slightly differently. The bridge is a little less rounded, a little flatter, so they can catch more strings at once. But it's ultimately simply sort of art music versus fiddly music. You heard it in my difference between Buttered Peas and James River Music Book, basically, or James River Minuet, sorry.
Well, thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Loren, David, and Paula for your presentation. We will be posting this to our YouTube channel to live in perpetuity. And I believe you had already had contact information at the end on the slide. And we'll be sharing this also in our newsletter tomorrow. And for anyone who's interested in diving into this in a different way, they can read the article Viols from Virginia, which is in the May issue of Early Music America's eMag, the magazine of Early Music America, which is available to subscribers and to the members. And you can find out about that on earlymusic.america.org. Loren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, David and Paula, for playing beautifully. Many thanks.
Thank you all for joining us, and we will make our next session will be in a couple of weeks, and we'll be making the announcement about that in the upcoming week about our next Monday interest session. And you can always find out the latest about Early Music America at our website, earlymusicamerica.org. Thank you once again for joining us.